The doorbell rang at 7:23 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday evening in Riverside Meadows, an upscale suburban community, where the biggest scandal was usually on painted mailbox. Sarah Martinez was preparing dinner when three men in police-like uniforms appeared at her front door, badges gleaming under the porch light. But what happened next would expose a conspiracy so twisted, it would shake this peaceful neighborhood to its core and reveal secrets that some people would kill to protect. Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of neighbor who kept to herself. Her husband, David, a software engineer, traveled frequently for work, leaving Sarah alone in their modest two-story home on Maple Street. To their neighbors, she was simply the quiet woman who tended her garden and walked her golden retriever, Max, every morning at precisely 6 a.m. What the neighbors didn't know was that Sarah Martinez wasn't just any suburban housewife. For the past 12 years, she had worked as an intelligence analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, specializing in domestic terrorism and organized crime networks. Her cover was perfect, so perfect that even David believed she worked as a freelance data consultant from home. Thought the trouble began 3 months earlier when the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association underwent a dramatic change in leadership. Richard Blackwood, a stern-faced man in his 50s with cold gray eyes and an expensive suit for every occasion, had been elected president after running an aggressive campaign promising to restore order and property values to the community. Blackwood wasted no time implementing his vision. Murals appeared weekly, grass couldn't exceed 2.5 inches in height. Holiday decorations were limited to a 14-day display period, and all exterior modifications required written approval from a newly formed architectural review committee. The HOA fees doubled overnight, justified by the hiring of a private security company called Neighborhood Protection Services. Sarah first encountered these so-called security officers on a Thursday morning when she returned from her jog to find men in pseudo-police uniforms photographing her front yard. When she questioned them, they claimed her garden gnome violated the new decorative object restrictions. The confrontation was brief, but unsettling. Something about their demeanor felt wrong. Predatory even, ma'am, we're just doing our job, the taller officer had said, his hand resting casually on what appeared to be a service weapon. Mr. Blackwood wants this neighborhood cleaned up, and that means everyone follows the rules. Over the following weeks, Sarah began noticing patterns that her CIA training had taught her to recognize. The security patrols weren't random. They targeted specific houses, always when the primary breadwinner was away. They conducted inspections that seemed more like intelligence gathering, asking probing questions about work schedules, travel plans, and family finances. Sarah's analytical mind began connecting dots that others missed. 3 families had been hit with massive fines for minor violations, forcing them to sell their homes quickly and below market value. Each property was subsequently purchased by a shell company called Riverside Holdings, LLC, a company that Sarah's preliminary research revealed was registered to none other than Richard Blackwood's wife. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. Use manufactured HOA violations and intimidation tactics to force homeowners to sell, then acquire their properties at steep discounts for future development. It was legal extortion disguised as neighborhood improvement. But Sarah's investigation took a dangerous turn when she began surveilling Blackwood's activities. Using skills honed through years of CIA field work, she documented meetings between Blackwood and the security company's owner, Marcus Webb, a man whose background check revealed prior arrests for fraud and intimidation. She photographed cash exchanges, recorded conversations, and compiled evidence that would expose the entire operation. What Sarah didn't realize was that she had become too visible. Her careful surveillance hadn't gone unnoticed. On that fateful Tuesday evening, the 3 uniformed men at her door weren't there for a routine inspection. Officer Jake Morrison, the lead man, wore a badge that looked official, but felt wrong in ways Sarah's trained eye immediately detected. Behind him stood officers Pete Ramirez and Tony Clark, both carrying equipment that seemed excessive for a simple HOA matter. Mrs. Martinez, Morrison began, his voice carrying an authority that didn't match his nervous fidgeting. We've received multiple complaints about illegal activities at this residence. We need to conduct an immediate search of the premises. Sarah's heart rate remained steady despite the surge of adrenaline. I'd like to see your warrant, she said calmly, her hand instinctively moving toward her purse where her real credentials lay hidden. Morrison's smile was cold and practiced. Ma'am, as authorized representatives of the Riverside Meadows HOA Security Division, we have the legal right to inspect any property for violations of community standards. This is outlined in Section 12.4 of your homeowner agreement. Show me the paperwork, Sarah insisted. But Morrison was already pushing past her into the foyer. What happened next would be captured on Sarah's hidden security cameras. Footage that would later become crucial evidence in a legal battle that would expose corruption reaching far beyond a simple HOA scam. The 3 men began systematically searching her home, claiming to look for unauthorized modifications, while clearly cataloging valuables and personal information. They photographed family pictures, rifled through mail, and asked increasingly invasive questions about David's work schedule and their financial situation. When Sarah demanded they leave, Morrison's facade finally cracked. Lady, you've been asking too many questions around the neighborhood, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Mr. Blackwood thinks you need to understand how things work around here. Maybe it's time you and your husband considered moving somewhere more suitable to your lifestyle. It was a direct threat, and Sarah knew she had reached a crossroads. She could continue playing the role of the helpless housewife, or she could reveal the truth about who she really was. The decision was made for her when Officer Clark emerged from David's home office carrying a folder containing Sarah's surveillance, photos of Blackwood and his associates. Well, Clark said with a smirk, looks like we've got ourselves a neighborhood snoop. These photos could be considered harassment, maybe even stalking. Morrison nodded gravely. Mrs. Martinez, I'm afraid we're going to have to place you under citizen's arrest for violation of privacy laws and harassment of a community official. As Morrison reached for the handcuffs on his belt, Sarah Martinez made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her purse, pulled out a leather credential case, and flipped it open. The room fell silent as the three fake officers stared at the official Central Intelligence Agency identification card bearing Sarah's photograph and clearance level. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to handling dangerous situations, "I believe it's time we had a different conversation." The silence in Sarah Martinez's living room stretched for what felt like an eternity. Three men who had entered her home with swagger and full authority now stood frozen, staring at credentials that transformed their victim into their worst nightmare. Officer Jake Morrison's face had drained of color as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. A CIA agent, a real federal agent, had been their target all along. The carefully orchestrated intimidation scheme that had worked flawlessly on dozens of other homeowners had just collided with someone who possessed the training, authority, and resources to destroy them. This has to be fake," Morrison stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. The CIA identification was clearly authentic, complete with holographic security features and clearance codes that would be impossible to forge. Sarah closed the credential case with a sharp snap, her demeanor completely transformed. Gone was the nervous suburban housewife. In her place stood a federal intelligence operative with 12 years of experience in high-stakes investigations. "I can assure you it's very real," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "And right now, you gentlemen are in violation of numerous federal laws, including impersonating law enforcement officers, breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and threatening a federal agent." Officer Pete Ramirez took a step backward, his hand instinctively moving away from the weapon on his belt. The magnitude of their mistake was becoming clear. They hadn't just targeted the wrong house. They had walked into a trap set by someone infinitely more dangerous than they had imagined. "We were just following orders," Ramirez said weakly. "Mr. Blackwood told us you were causing trouble in the neighborhood." Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. "Following orders, I see. And I suppose Mr. Blackwood also ordered you to impersonate police officers, to break into homes without warrants, to threaten residents with weapons you're not licensed to carry." The truth was that Sarah had been building a case against the fake HOA security operation for weeks, but she had been working carefully, methodically, waiting for the right moment to spring her trap. She hadn't expected them to walk directly into her home and hand her the evidence she needed on a silver platter. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, moving to her laptop and opening a program that would live stream everything to a secure CIA server. "You're going to sit down, put your hands where I can see them, and tell me everything about this operation. Every detail, every name, every property you've targeted." Morrison's desperation was evident as he made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "Look, Agent Martinez, we can work something out here. This is just a neighborhood dispute. No need to involve federal agencies." "Oh, but it stopped being a neighborhood dispute the moment you impersonated federal officers," Sarah replied, producing her service weapon from a concealed holster. "And it became a national security matter when your background checks revealed connections to organized crime networks that my agency has been monitoring." This wasn't entirely true. Sarah had discovered the organized crime connections only after beginning her investigation into Blackwood. But the bluff had its intended effect. All three men immediately raised their hands and moved to the couch as directed. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah extracted confessions that painted a picture of corruption far more extensive than she had initially suspected. The fake security company was just one arm of an elaborate real estate fraud scheme orchestrated by Richard Blackwood and backed by investors with ties to money laundering operations. The scheme worked like clockwork. Blackwood's associates would identify stable, middle-class neighborhoods with potential for development. They would infiltrate the Homeowners Association, implement increasingly restrictive and expensive rules, then use intimidation tactics to force residents to sell at below market prices. The properties would then be purchased through shell companies and either developed or resold at massive profits. Riverside Meadows was their 7th successful operation, with plans to expand to 12 more communities across 3 states. The fake security officers were recruited from a pool of ex-felons and desperate men willing to do anything for steady pay and the illusion of authority. But as Sarah compiled their confessions, she realized the case was about to become significantly more complicated. David's car had just pulled into the driveway. He was returning early from his business trip. The sound of the garage door opening sent a wave of panic through the 3 detained men. But Sarah remained calm. She had dealt with more challenging situations during her CIA career, and explaining this to her husband would be manageable compared to infiltrating terrorist cells in hostile territories. David walked through the front door expecting to surprise his wife with an early return, only to find 3 men in custody and his wife holding a service weapon he had never seen before. "Sarah, what the hell is going on here?" David's voice was a mixture of confusion and alarm as he took in the scene. This was the moment Sarah had dreaded for years. The moment when her carefully constructed cover story would finally crumble. She had always known this day might come, but she had hoped it would be under different circumstances. "David, I need you to stay calm and listen to me carefully," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "These men broke into our house tonight as part of a fraud scheme targeting our neighborhood. They've been detained until federal agents arrive to take them into custody." "Federal agents? Sarah, who are you calling? And where did you get that gun?" Sarah took a deep breath and made the decision to reveal the truth that would change their marriage forever. "David, there's something I need to tell you about my work. Something I should have told you years ago." She retrieved her CIA credentials and handed them to her husband, watching as his face cycled through disbelief, shock, and finally, a strange mixture of pride and betrayal. You work for the CIA?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "For how long?" 12 years, since before we met." The room fell silent again as David processed this revelation. His wife, the woman he had shared a bed with for 8 years, the woman who made him coffee every morning and worried about their mortgage payments, was a federal intelligence agent. The data consulting work, he asked. "Cover story. I've been working on domestic terrorism and organized crime cases from our home office." David sat down heavily in his armchair. The weight of 8 years of marriage built on a fundamental lie, settling over him. What else don't I know about you?" Before Sarah could answer, her secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from her handler at CIA headquarters. The fake officer's background checks had triggered automatic alerts in multiple federal databases, and her live stream had been flagged for immediate supervisory review. Agent Martinez came the voice of Director Patricia Hayes. "Sarah's immediate supervisor, we're tracking your situation. A tactical team is en route to your location, and we've initiated a full investigation into this network. Are you secure?" "Affirmative." "Director, 3 suspects in custody. Full confessions recorded. But we have a bigger problem. This appears to be a multi-state operation with potential money laundering connections." "Understood. Federal prosecutors are being briefed as we speak. This is now a joint FBI-CIA operation under the Organized Crime Task Force protocols." As Sarah ended the call, she turned to face her husband and the 3 detained men who had inadvertently triggered a federal investigation that would span multiple agencies and potentially dozens of defendants. "David, I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to understand something," she said, her voice carrying both professional authority and personal vulnerability. "Everything I did was to protect people like us, ordinary families who just want to live their lives without being victimized by criminals." Morrison, who had been listening to the conversation with growing despair, finally spoke up. "Agent Martinez, what's going to happen to us?" Sarah's expression was cold and professional. "That depends on how cooperative you are with federal investigators. But I can tell you this: impersonating federal officers while threatening a CIA agent tends to result in very long prison sentences." As sirens began wailing in the distance, Sarah realized that her quiet suburban cover was about to be blown forever. But more importantly, she had uncovered a criminal enterprise that threatened the safety and financial security of hundreds of innocent families. The real fight was just beginning. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles buzzed with an energy that only high-profile criminal cases could generate. Media vans lined the street. Reporters clutched their microphones, and federal marshals maintained strict security protocols as the United States versus Richard Blackwood and Associates prepared to begin. Sarah Martinez sat in the witness section, her CIA credentials now a matter of public record thanks to pretrial motions that had exposed her identity. The quiet suburban cover she had maintained for over a decade was gone forever. But the sacrifice had been worth it. The investigation she had triggered had uncovered a criminal network spanning 7 states and involving over $50 million in fraudulent real estate transactions. At the prosecution table, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chen shuffled through evidence files that represented 18 months of intensive federal investigation. The case against Richard Blackwood and his associates was built on Sarah's initial evidence, but it had grown far beyond a simple HOA fraud scheme. The defendant's table told the story of how far the conspiracy had reached. Richard Blackwood sat in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the defeat in his eyes. Next to him, Marcus Webb, the owner of Neighborhood Protection Services, nervously adjusted his tie while his attorney whispered urgent advice. The 3 fake officers, Morrison, Ramirez, and Clark, occupied the far end of the table. Clearly, understanding that their roles as low-level operatives made them expendable. But the most significant defendant wasn't present in the courtroom. Vincent Torino, the alleged mastermind behind the money laundering operation that had funded the real estate scheme, remained a fugitive, wanted by both the FBI and Interpol for his connections to organized crime families in 3 countries. Judge Margaret Sullivan called the court to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here for the trial of United States versus Blackwood. Prosecutor Chen, you may begin your opening statement. Chen rose with the confidence of someone holding an unbeatable hand. Your Honor, members of the jury, over the next several days, you will hear evidence of a criminal conspiracy so brazen, so systematic, that it reads like fiction. But I assure you, every word you hear will be backed by documented evidence, recorded conversations, and video surveillance. She walked to the evidence table and lifted a thick folder. The defendants didn't just commit fraud. They created an entire fake law enforcement agency to terrorize innocent families. They impersonated federal officers, broke into homes without warrants, and used threats of violence to steal people's most valuable possessions, their homes. Chen's opening was methodical and devastating. She outlined how Blackwood's scheme had evolved from simple horror manipulation to a sophisticated criminal enterprise backed by laundered money from Vincent Torino's organization. The jury listened with growing amazement as she described the network of shell companies, fake security firms, and corrupt officials that had enabled the conspiracy. But this case isn't just about financial fraud, Chen continued, her voice rising with controlled passion. It's about what happens when criminals believe they can operate with impunity. When they think ordinary citizens have no recourse against organized intimidation. She turned to look directly at Sarah. Fortunately for the dozens of families victimized by this scheme, one of those ordinary citizens turned out to be someone with the training, authority, and courage to fight back. The defense team's opening statement, delivered by Blackwood's attorney, Michael Reeves, attempted to portray the entire scheme as a legitimate business operation that had been misconstrued by federal agents eager to justify their existence. Members of the jury, Reeves argued, my client Richard Blackwood is a successful businessman who recognized an opportunity to improve struggling neighborhoods while generating reasonable profits. The prosecution wants you to believe that standard real estate development practices constitute criminal conspiracy. But Reeves' argument crumbled almost immediately when Chen began presenting evidence. The first bombshell came when Chen played audio recordings that Sarah had captured during her surveillance of Blackwood's meetings with Marcus Webb. In crystal clear quality, the jury heard Blackwood discussing specific intimidation tactics to be used against problematic homeowners. We need to make them understand that fighting back isn't worth it. Blackwood's voice echoed through the courtroom. A few families get the full treatment: late night visits, property damage, threats to their kids' safety, and word spreads. Fear is more effective than lawsuits. The recordings were devastating. But Chen was just getting started. She introduced evidence showing direct payments from Torino's money laundering network to Blackwood's various shell companies, totaling over $12 million in funding for the real estate acquisition scheme. Ladies and gentlemen, Chen said, holding up bank records. This money didn't come from legitimate real estate investors. Federal financial crimes investigators have traced these funds through multiple offshore accounts connected to drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and extortion operations. But the prosecution's most dramatic moment came when Sarah took the witness stand. Her testimony began with a methodical recounting of her CIA background and the skills that had enabled her to recognize and investigate the conspiracy. Agent Martinez, Chen asked, when the defendants broke into your home on the evening of March 15th, did you fear for your safety? Yes, Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. Based on their behavior, equipment, and obvious willingness to impersonate law enforcement officers, I assess them as a credible threat requiring immediate federal intervention. And what was your assessment of the broader criminal operation they represented? Sarah's answer sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Based on my analysis of their methods, funding sources, and organizational structure, I determined that this was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with connections to organized crime networks that pose a national security threat. The defense team's cross-examination attempted to portray Sarah as an overzealous federal agent who had entrapped innocent businessmen. But their strategy backfired spectacularly when Chen introduced evidence that Blackwood's organization had specifically targeted Sarah's home because they had identified her as a potential whistleblower. Agent Martinez, defense attorney Reeves asked, isn't it true that you initiated surveillance of my client without proper authorization? Sarah's smile was sharp. Mr. Reeves, as a private citizen concerned about criminal activity in my neighborhood, I had every right to document suspicious behavior occurring on public property. The fact that my professional training made me more effective at gathering evidence doesn't invalidate the evidence. The courtroom erupted when Chen presented her next piece of evidence. Security footage from Sarah's hidden cameras showing the three fake officers conducting what they believed was a covert search of her home while she was supposedly absent. On the video, Morrison could be clearly heard instructing his associates to plant something that will justify an arrest if they couldn't find sufficient evidence of Sarah's surveillance activities. Look for anything we can use. Morrison's voice echoed through the courtroom. Computer files, cameras, anything that makes her look like a stalker or a threat. Blackwood wants her discredited before she causes more problems. The footage was damning evidence of conspiracy to commit perjury and tampering with evidence, adding federal felony charges to the growing list of crimes. But the prosecution's final revelation would prove to be the most shocking of all. Chen approached the witness stand where a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit sat waiting to testify. Frank Morrison, Jake Morrison's younger brother and a former accountant for Torino's organization, had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for witness protection. Mr. Morrison, Chen began, can you tell the jury about your relationship with Vincent Torino? I was his chief financial officer for 7 years, Frank Morrison replied. I managed the money laundering operations, including the funding for real estate acquisition schemes like the one Richard Blackwood was running. And did Mr. Torino have specific instructions regarding how these schemes should be conducted? Frank Morrison's answer would change everything. Yes, Vincent always said that if any operation got too much attention from law enforcement, we should eliminate the threat. When my brother called to report that they had accidentally targeted a CIA agent, Vincent's orders were very clear. The courtroom fell silent as Chen asked the question that everyone was dreading. What were those orders, Mr. Morrison? Vincent told my brother to make sure Agent Martinez had an accident. He said a dead federal agent would create too much heat. But if she died in what appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong, the investigation would focus on finding random criminals instead of uncovering the broader conspiracy. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized how close she had come to becoming a casualty of the very investigation she had initiated. The fake HOA officers hadn't just been trying to intimidate her, they had been preparing to murder her. As Frank Morrison's testimony continued, revealing the full scope of Torino's criminal empire and its connections to real estate fraud schemes across the country. Sarah understood that her decision to flash her CIA credentials that night had saved not just her own life, but potentially the lives of dozens of other families who had been targeted by the conspiracy. The trial was approaching its climax, but the biggest revelation was yet to come. The jury had been deliberating for 3 days when Judge Sullivan called them back into the courtroom. The tension was palpable as 12 citizens who had spent weeks hearing testimony about conspiracy, murder plots, and organized crime prepared to deliver their verdict on one of the most complex federal cases in recent memory. Sarah Martinez sat in the gallery next to her husband David. Their relationship forever changed, but somehow stronger after months of couples therapy and honest conversations about the realities of her CIA career. The fake suburban life was gone, but in its place was something more genuine, a marriage built on truth rather than carefully constructed lies. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Sullivan asked. The foreman, a retired school principal named Robert Chen, stood with obvious gravity. We have, Your Honor, on the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud. How do you find the defendant Richard Blackwood guilty? On the charge of conspiracy to commit money laundering, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. The verdicts continued for nearly 20 minutes as the jury delivered guilty findings on all major charges against all defendants. Richard Blackwood would face life in prison. Marcus Webb received 35 years. The 3 fake officers, Morrison, Ramirez, and Clark, were sentenced to terms ranging from 15 to 25 years each. But as Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chen savored her victory, her secure phone buzzed with an urgent message that would transform triumph into a new kind of terror. During the jury deliberations, FBI agents working with Interpol had finally tracked down Vincent Torino in a villa outside Marseille, France. But when they moved to arrest him, they discovered something that sent shockwaves through multiple federal agencies. Torino had been dead for 6 months. Killed execution style in what appeared to be an internal organized crime dispute. If Torino had been dead for 6 months, then who had been directing the conspiracy during the final phases of the investigation? Who had ordered Sarah's assassination? And most importantly, who was the real mastermind behind a criminal network that had continued operating seamlessly despite the apparent death of its leader? The answer came in a phone call that Sarah received as she and David were leaving the courthouse. Agent Martinez, this is Director Hayes. We need you to report to the federal building immediately. We have a situation. An hour later, Sarah sat in a secure conference room with her CIA handler, FBI Director William Morrison, and U.S. Attorney Chen. The revelation they shared would prove that the trial had been just the beginning of a much larger investigation. Agent Martinez, Director Hayes began. Our forensic accountants have discovered something disturbing. The money laundering network that funded Blackwood's operation continued receiving and distributing funds throughout the entire period when Vincent Torino was supposedly dead. FBI Director Morrison leaned forward. We believe Torino faked his own death to avoid federal prosecution, but continued operating through intermediaries. However, our investigation has revealed something even more troubling. He slid a classified file across the table. The bank accounts used to fund the real estate fraud schemes weren't just connected to traditional organized crime. Some of these transactions appeared to be linked to foreign intelligence operations. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she processed the implications. Are you saying this was a national security matter from the beginning? We're saying, Director Hayes replied grimly, that your neighborhood HOA fraud may have been a cover for a much more sophisticated operation designed to identify and compromise federal agents living in suburban communities. The truth was staggering. The targeting of Riverside Meadows hadn't been random. It had been carefully chosen because intelligence indicated that multiple federal agents and defense contractors lived in the community under assumed identities. The HOA fraud scheme was designed to force these individuals to reveal themselves when they fought back against the intimidation tactics. Sarah's CIA credentials hadn't just exposed her identity to local criminals. They had potentially blown her cover to foreign intelligence services that had been systematically hunting American agents. How many other agents were compromised? Sarah asked. We're still determining that, Hayes replied. But preliminary investigation suggests similar operations in at least 12 other communities across 6 states. We may be looking at the largest counterintelligence breach in CIA history. As Sarah absorbed this revelation, her secure phone rang with a call that would provide the final, shocking twist to a case that had already defied every expectation. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was unmistakably familiar. Hello, Agent Martinez. I believe we need to talk. It was Vincent Torino, very much alive and calling from a location that CIA satellites would later determine was less than 50 miles from the feed. Rail Courthouse, Mr. Torino, Sarah said, activating the recording function as other agents scrambled to trace the call. I was under the impression you were dead. A useful fiction that allowed me to observe how federal law enforcement would respond to the exposure of my network. Torino replied, I must say, your performance was quite impressive. Exactly the kind of resourcefulness that makes CIA agents so valuable. What do you want? Torino's laugh was cold and calculating. I want to offer you a job, Agent Martinez. You've proven that you can identify and dismantle criminal networks with remarkable efficiency. That's a skill set that certain international organizations value very highly. Sarah looked around the room at her colleagues, all of whom were frantically coordinating a manhunt while simultaneously trying to assess the full scope of the counterintelligence damage. "I'm not interested in your job offer," Sarah said firmly. "I thought you might say that. But consider this. Your actions have exposed dozens of federal agents to foreign intelligence services. Those agents are now in mortal danger because of your decision to reveal your CIA credentials to my associates. Perhaps working with me would be a way to balance the scales." The call ended abruptly, but the message was clear. Vincent Torino wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a broker of information who sold intelligence to the highest bidder, including hostile foreign governments. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in her new office at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Her suburban cover was gone forever, but her role had evolved into something far more significant. She now headed a joint CIA-FBI task force dedicated to identifying and dismantling criminal networks that targeted federal agents and their families. The Riverside Meadows case had exposed a vulnerability that no one in the intelligence community had anticipated. The suburbanization of American espionage had made agents vulnerable to criminals, sophisticated enough to exploit the very normalcy that was supposed to protect them. David had taken early retirement from his software engineering job and moved to Virginia with Sarah, finally understanding that his wife's real job was more important than any cover story could convey. Their marriage was different now, built on truth, mutual respect, and shared understanding of the risks inherent in protecting national security. But the case wasn't over. Vincent Torino remained at large, continuing to operate a network that sold information about American intelligence assets to foreign buyers. The fake HOA officers were serving their sentences, but they represented just the lowest level of an organization that reached into international criminal syndicates and hostile intelligence services. As Sarah reviewed intelligence reports about similar operations in other communities, she realized that her confrontation with 3 fake security officers in her living room had been just the opening move in a much larger game. A game where the stakes were measured not in stolen homes or defrauded families, but in the safety and security of the United States itself. The doorbell that had rung on that quiet Tuesday evening had announced more than just 3 criminals looking for an easy target. It had announced the beginning of a new kind of warfare, where America's enemies use the very openness and normalcy of suburban life as weapons against the people sworn to protect the nation. And somewhere, in a location known only to the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the world, Vincent Torino was planning his next move in a game where federal agents and their families were off the players and the stakes. The real question wasn't whether he would strike again. The question was whether Sarah Martinez and her task force would be ready when he did. But this story was just the beginning, because 3 weeks ago, Sarah Martinez received a package at her CIA office containing photographs of federal agents and their families in 12 different cities. Agents whose covers have been blown by criminal networks using methods identical to the Riverside Meadows operation. And attached to those photographs was a simple note: "The game continues." BT The hunt for Vincent Torino and his network of criminal intelligence brokers has become the CIS's highest domestic priority. But every day that passes means more federal agents are at risk, more families are in danger, and more national security assets are being sold to America's enemies. This is the story of how a fake HOA enforcement action became a national security crisis. But it's also the story of how ordinary Americans, even those with extraordinary jobs, fight back when criminals threaten everything they hold dear.